My parents spent my entire childhood mocking my dreams. Now that I'm a millionaire, they want me to buy them a house. They say it's the least I can do, but I remember everything. There's a photograph that used to hang crooked in the hallway of my childhood home. It was a blurry, yellowed print of me at 7 years old, wearing a mismatched cape I had stitched from torn curtains, standing atop a cardboard box fortress I had engineered with meticulous tape-layering precision. My expression was a mix of wonder and conviction, the kind of look that dared the world to try and tell me magic wasn't real. But magic wasn't welcome in that house. Not the kind I believed in, anyway. To my parents, that moment captured something absurd, something they would bring up for years with scoffing laughter like a joke that never quite got old. "Look at that," my father would chuckle, jabbing his beer bottle in the air toward the frame. Thought he was gonna fly off the roof and become Superman or some crap. "You remember that, honey?" And my mother, eyes rolling as though she hadn't seen it coming, would always offer the same weary sigh. God help him. He always lived in some fantasy. We thought he'd grow out of it, but he just got worse. Worse, by their definition, meant dreaming. It meant daring to sketch blueprints for machines that didn't yet exist, scripting worlds full of sentient machines and cities in the sky, staying up past midnight under the covers with a flashlight and notebook, creating realms of limitless imagination. Worse meant applying for art schools and tech fellowships instead of med school or law school. It meant not subscribing to their blueprint of reality, the one boxed inside their suburban expectations, where a 401k was more important than wonder, and security came at the cost of self. I remember every word, every sneer, every scoff hidden beneath forced smiles at parent-teacher nights. "He's just different," they'd say to the other adults, as if different was a diagnosis. They never failed to mention their disappointment with pride masked as humor. "We don't know where he gets it from. We're realists. Practical. He's always got his head in the clouds." What they meant to say was, "He scares us. He doesn't fit. He won't do what he's told." They weren't cruel in the overt tabloid way. They didn't hit me or lock me in basements or leave me without dinner. Their version of cruelty was quieter, more insidious. It came in the form of never asking about my passions, never attending the science fair I worked 4 months for, never once saying, "I believe in you." It came in the way my sketchbooks disappeared from the kitchen table, tossed somewhere between accidental spills and forgotten trash pickups. It lived in their refusal to engage, their mocking impersonations of my latest ideas, their constant reminders to get my head out of the clouds because clouds don't pay the bills. But I never forgot. I didn't grow up vowing revenge. I didn't harbor plans of proving them wrong out of spite. That's the thing. They weren't worth that kind of obsession. My resolve grew like a tree in a storm, not to defeat the wind, but to withstand it. I learned to wrap roots around pain, to draw water from dismissal. I carved validation out of solitude. While they laughed, I worked. Quietly. Consistently. On scholarships, they said I'd never win. In programs they thought were beneath notice. I learned code and design. I built apps they'd never understand. I networked in silence. I scraped by, slept on couches, lived on instant noodles in windowless studios. They never visited, never called. Then one day it all changed. Not for them. For me. The moment was anticlimactic in the most poetic way. A product demo I pitched over Zoom went viral in an investors group. Overnight, my inbox swelled with offers. 6 figures at first, then 7. My name began to circulate in conversations I'd never been invited into before. A month later, I signed the first acquisition deal. A month after that, I was leading a tech incubator with global reach. Interviews, TED Talks, panels. I became the blueprint for the dreamers they used to scoff at. Forbes, Entrepreneur, Wired, all of them called. I smiled for the cameras, spoke humbly, played the role of the self-made man. But in my core, I knew. I remembered, which brings us to now. I was standing on the balcony of my downtown penthouse, floor-to-ceiling glass, imported wood, the skyline glittering like a constellation sculpted by ambition, when the call came through. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered out of reflex. "Hello? Oh, thank God." My mother's voice filled the line, wrapped in a tremble that sounded rehearsed. "We've been trying to reach you. You never call home." Home. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a thief returning to a museum and trying to claim authorship of stolen artifacts. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Decorum has a muscle memory. "Well, your father and we've been thinking about the future. You know, we're not getting any younger, and this house, it's really not suitable anymore." I said nothing. Let the silence grow teeth. She cleared her throat. "We saw online. You've done so well. We're proud of you." The lie slithered through the line. She couldn't even say the words with a straight voice. "And? Well, we thought maybe you could help. Just a bit. A new place. Something comfortable. You know, it's the least you could do after all we've done for you." The least. A laugh started in my gut and crawled up my chest before I could stop it. Not a loud one, but sharp and crystalline, slicing the air like glass against porcelain. "Everything you did for me," I repeated softly. "Yes. We raised you. Put a roof over your head. Sacrificed so much." I turned from the balcony, stepping back into the warmth of a space I built with hands no one held. "You mean you fed me and mocked me, kept me clothed while stripping me of confidence, made sure I never forgot that my dreams were embarrassing? That's what you mean?" There was silence. It stretched like a rubber band, taut and ready to snap. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Oh, it's perfectly fair," I said. "I remember everything. I remember when you said only idiots go to art school. When you told me to be realistic because no one ever made money from weird computer stuff. I remember you never asking about my work. I remember the silence when I finally made it. No congratulations. No apology. Just this sudden phone call when you need something." Her voice cracked then. "But we're your parents. And that meant something once," I said. "But now, it's just biology. You don't get a reward for doubting me. You don't get a mansion because I found the strength to believe in myself when you never did." "Please," she murmured. "It's just a house." "No," I said quietly. "It's a monument. And I don't build those for people who tried to bury me beneath their own fear." I hung up, not out of rage, not even out of satisfaction, but because the past doesn't deserve to linger when the present has already outgrown it. And yet, long after the call ended, I found myself drifting toward the hallway in my own home, toward a frame I hadn't touched in years, a replica of that old photo, me at 7, standing atop my box kingdom, smiling into the unknown. He's still here, not broken, not bitter, but unbought. The sun had long since dipped below the city skyline, leaving the high-rise wrapped in a warm amber hush, the kind that seeps through glass and bathes every polished surface in soft gold. I stood in my office, a sprawling space walled in bookcases and overlooked by a hand-painted mural I'd commissioned from an underground artist whose work had once inspired one of my earliest prototypes. Beneath that mural stood my desk, a blend of steel and black walnut, heavy with the weight of ideas that once lived only in my head and were now worth more than everything my parents had ever owned, combined. The phone call was still echoing in my ears, even hours after I'd hung up. Their voices had grown thin with age, but that age hadn't softened the edges of their words. No, the jagged parts of them had only calcified, grown sharper with time. I had expected, in some part of my mind, that they might reach out one day, that there might be a crack in the earth they'd built between us, a tremble of regret, an apology thinly veiled behind their usual bravado. But that wasn't what I received. What I got instead was entitlement wrapped in nostalgia, an invoice for a debt I never agreed to owe. And yet, instead of closing the door entirely, I found myself reaching for something I hadn't touched in years. The leather-bound journal I kept locked in the bottom drawer of my desk. It wasn't for business notes or venture plans. It was personal, a graveyard of moments, pages thick with ink and memory. Some entries were scratched in frustration, others written with calm precision, as if documenting my own dissection. And somewhere near the center, there was a page titled, "Things I Will Never Forget," a ledger of every humiliation, every sideways glance, every evening when I'd gone to sleep wondering if I was stupid for trying to be more than ordinary. I read over them now, slowly, letting the memories rise like smoke from an old fire. March 11th, age 13. Dad laughed in front of the dinner guests when I said I wanted to build an AI that could write music, called me our little robot whisperer, and asked if I'd found my tinfoil hat yet. July 22nd, age 16. Mom threw out my notebooks when she cleaned the kitchen. Said she thought they were trash. That was 2 weeks of handwritten algorithms and sketches gone. November 3rd, age 18. Found out they didn't send my application to the tech competition I asked them to mail. You wouldn't have won anyway, she said. Didn't want you getting your hopes up. There were dozens more. Small, yes, but cumulative. And now they wanted a house. A sanctuary built from the bones of the dreams they'd tried to smother. I knew I wouldn't sleep. Not with all this clawing inside me. So I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I wrote them a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter. Longhand. On paper thick enough to carry the weight of history. Not for their benefit, but for mine. Dear Mother and Father, I've debated whether or not to respond at all. At first I thought silence was the most dignified answer. But the truth is, silence leaves too much space for self-pity and reinvention. And I know you. You will rewrite the story if I let you. You'll turn yourselves into the misunderstood heroes of my life, the struggling parents who just didn't know how to show love. You'll say things like, "We only wanted what was best for you," or "We were just trying to protect you from failure." And you'll believe it, because that's easier than facing what you really were. Obstacles. You weren't just indifferent. You were actively discouraging. You didn't merely doubt me. You made a sport of it, mocked me. Repeatedly, publicly, privately. You convinced yourselves that you were grounding me, but all you did was chain me to the smallness of your own imaginations. And now, after years of silence, you call me, not to make amends, but to ask for a house. As if success erases memory. As if money is a bandage big enough to cover every bruise you can't see. You didn't build this. You don't get to live in it. You said, "It's the least I can do." But here's what I think. The least I can do is remind you who I became without you. You made me doubt myself for the better part of 2 decades, but I kept going, not because of your lessons, but in spite of them. And that difference matters. It's everything. I'm not bitter. Bitterness implies that I've been poisoned, but I'm not poisoned. I'm clear-eyed, and I remember. Enjoy your house, the one you already have. Sincerely your son, the one who dared to believe in things bigger than your vision. I sealed it and left it in the outgoing mail, not because I expected it would change them, but because it mattered that I said it. For years, I had internalized their silence, their mockery, carried it like a second skin. But now, with every word I'd written, I could feel that skin peeling away. And still, they lingered in my thoughts. They'd always told me I'd end up broke, humiliated, crawling back for a job at the local bank. I never did. But sometimes, when the nights are long and the lights of the city blur through the glass like liquid memory, I wonder, was I trying to prove something to the world, or just to them? That thought followed me through the week. Even as my schedule stacked up with investor meetings, board presentations, and prototype reviews, that letter pulsed at the edge of my mind like a heartbeat. I tried to distract myself with success. Sleek cars, dinners with influencers, lavish hotel conferences where people called me genius, visionary, disruptor. But none of those titles meant as much as the word I never got to hear from them, beloved. Then on Thursday, my assistant forwarded me an email with the subject line, "Your parents showed up at HQ." I paused, read it twice. My stomach coiled. They had walked in, unannounced, at the front desk of my corporate headquarters, apparently expecting to be welcomed like visiting royalty. They told the receptionist they were my parents, that they were finally ready to be part of their son's life. No, not part of it. Beneficiaries of it. I had them escorted out, politely, professionally, but the damage had been done. The past had walked through my glass doors and stained the air. That night I stayed late at the office, the city quiet beneath me, and stared at my hands. The same hands that used to tremble with anxiety in school hallways, that used to clutch spiral notebooks filled with inventions no one believed in. They had built everything, not theirs, mine. Still, something inside me burned. Not anger, not sadness. Something more complex. A hunger to confront them, not through letters, not through security guards, but face to face. So, I booked a flight. Not out of longing, out of necessity. It was time to return, not to reconcile, to reclaim. Their house hadn't changed. The same peeling paint on the porch railings, the same crooked screen door that always creaked like it was about to fall off. I stood outside it now, wearing a coat that cost more than their monthly mortgage, and watched the curtains twitch. They'd seen me, and still no one opened the door. Typical. I rang the bell once, twice. Finally, the door creaked open and my mother stood there, smaller than I remembered. Her hair was thinner, her eyes tired, but the moment they met mine, they sharpened. Not with joy, but caution. "You came," she said. "Not for long," I replied. Inside, my father sat in his recliner, flipping through a newspaper as though we were just picking up from some paused chapter. "Didn't think you'd have the guts," he said, not looking up. "Didn't come to prove anything," I answered, stepping in. The air smelled the same, dust, fried food, something sour beneath it. "Well," my mother said, fidgeting with her sleeves, "if you're here to talk about the house, I'm not." The silence landed like a dropped glass. "I came to give you a chance," I said slowly, clearly. "One chance, to tell me the truth, about why you did it, why you tried so hard to convince me I'd fail." My father scoffed. "We did what any parent would do. We prepared you for reality." "No," I said. "You prepared me to be small, to shrink, to hide my light so it wouldn't scare you. But I need to know why." My mother looked at me then, and for the first time, something broke in her face. Not sorrow, but fear. Like she was standing in front of a mirror that showed her every flaw she'd ignored. "Because we were scared," she whispered. "Because we didn't understand you. And instead of learning how to support you, we tried to pull you back. It was easier, safer. And you thought crushing my spirit was a fair trade for your comfort?" She flinched. "We didn't know. We didn't think." "You didn't want to think," I said, "because it would have made you look in the mirror." My father finally looked up. "So what now? You come here to throw it in our face?" "No," I said, walking to the doorway. "I came to tell you that I don't owe you anything. Not a house, not a check, not my time. You had your chance to be in my life. You buried it under your fear, and now I'm digging it back up, without you." I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't need to. Their silence was louder than anything I could have said. As I stepped back onto the porch, the cold air rushed in like a baptism. I stood there, not as a boy begging to be seen, but as a man who had made himself visible, even in the face of their willful blindness. The chapter wasn't over. The story hadn't ended. But I had taken the pen back, and this time, I was writing the rest on my terms. The return flight was quiet, but my mind wasn't. 40,000 feet in the sky, surrounded by silence and the white noise hum of the engines, I sat in my private cabin, facing a dark window that reflected only myself, and sifted through the aftermath of words that should have been spoken decades ago. There was no victory in the confrontation, no catharsis, only a profound emptiness layered with clarity, like walking out of a burning building only to realize the fire had never truly been put out, merely ignored long enough to burn itself cold. The truth? I had wanted something, not a house, not validation, but an explanation. A wound needs meaning before it can scar over clean. Instead, all I received was cowardice masquerading as fear, and fear masquerading as love. They had mistaken parenting for preservation, treating my ambition like a contagion they needed to quarantine. And now, after all this time, the damage was done. It wasn't about forgiveness, not anymore. It was about release. Letting go of the illusion that one day they'd rise to meet me in the light. They wouldn't. They were still crouched in the same emotional basement, surrounded by outdated maps of how to live a life, unwilling to acknowledge that I'd crossed an ocean while they were too scared to leave the harbor. By the time I landed, the city had slipped into the cobalt hush before dawn, that fragile hour when everything holds its breath, waiting for the world to wake. My driver met me with a silent nod and opened the door. The car smelled like leather and bergamot, sterile but comforting. We didn't speak. He knew better than to ask questions. Back at the penthouse, I didn't sleep. I went straight to the kitchen and made coffee the way I always did. Strong, black, unadorned. The kind of coffee that didn't flinch, the kind that stared back. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city begin to stir beneath me, and wondered who I had become in the absence of their approval. A millionaire, yes. A leader. A creator. A name that echoed in boardrooms and Silicon Valley podcasts. But behind it all, a ghost still lingered. The ghost of a child who once built worlds in secret, dreaming of applause that never came. Success doesn't erase trauma. It just makes it easier to decorate. You can wrap your pain in Italian suits and 5-star dinners and performance bonuses, but the ache remains. It hides behind every award, every compliment, every deal closed with a pen dipped in your own blood. The ache of knowing you had to raise yourself emotionally, that the people who were supposed to be your first audience were too busy booing to notice the show. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in years. The ability had been buried somewhere between college rejections and birthday parties spent alone. But I did feel something sharp and wordless settle into my chest that morning. Not grief, not rage. Something more primal. Like the body remembering a wound it learned to live with, but never quite healed. I spent the rest of the week buried in work. That's what high-functioning people with unresolved trauma do. We perform. We outwork. We produce. I signed 3 new partnerships, launched a beta product that crashed the server with demand, and sat through interviews where journalists tried to excavate my childhood like archaeologists digging through rubble. So, your parents, were they supportive of your dreams? I paused, smiled politely, and gave them the sanitized answer. They had different values, but I always believed in what I was doing. Translation: they made me feel worthless, but I turned that into profit. People like neat arcs, redemption, reconciliation. The prodigal child returning home, wiser and forgiving, arms open with charity and warmth. But that wasn't my story. Mine was more complicated. It wasn't cinematic. It was raw, unscripted, often lonely. And despite the money and the accolades, I still woke up some mornings wondering if I was enough. Not for them, but for myself. Then one night, everything changed. I was reviewing code for a new AI interface when my assistant buzzed through the intercom. "Mr. Hart, sorry to interrupt, but there's someone downstairs demanding to see you." I sighed. "Tell them to schedule. They say it's urgent. A woman. She's upset." I stiffened. "Name?" "She said you'd know. Her name is Anna." That name hit me like a gust of wind through a house of cards. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly breathless. Anna. Not my mother. Not an investor. Not a journalist. Anna. The one person from my past who had seen me before the world did. Who'd known me not as the polished public figure, but as the boy who once showed her blueprints scribbled on diner napkins and told her, in a whisper, "One day, this is going to change everything." I buzzed back. "Send her up." Minutes later, she stood in the threshold of my office, looking simultaneously familiar and altered. Time had sketched soft lines across her face, but her eyes, green and unblinking, were exactly the same. Observant, unsparing, beautiful in the way quiet defiance always is. "I almost didn't come," she said, stepping in. "But I figured you should know. Your parents are telling people you're buying them a mansion. They've been showing photos around town, acting like heroes, like they raised you to be this." I closed my laptop. Of course they are. They're telling the story in a way that makes them look like prophets. Like they believed in you all along. They even told someone they paid for your first startup. I laughed bitterly. They didn't pay for my glasses. You remember how I used to solder parts from old printers just to build prototypes? They told me I was wasting my time. "I remember," she said quietly, "and I couldn't let them rewrite it." We sat in silence for a long time. Not uncomfortable, but charged with memory. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the night I chose the dream over everything else, including her. A decision I told myself was necessary. That sacrifice was the price of vision. But now, looking at her, I wasn't so sure. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "For what?" "For leaving the way I did. For letting the work consume everything. For making it seem like I didn't care." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You always cared. Just about different things." "Maybe. But I think I confused survival with success. She tilted her head. And now? Now I realize I spent my whole life trying to prove something to people who were never watching, and I lost the ones who were. Her silence was the most honest reply I could have asked for. That night, after she left, I sat down and opened a blank document. Not a business proposal, not a letter of resignation or apology, but something new, something dangerous. A memoir. Not for the public, not for profit. For me. It began with a sentence I had never allowed myself to say aloud. I was never the son they wanted, but I became the man they never deserved. I wrote for hours, poured everything into it. The shame, the rage, the small victories. The nights I almost gave up. The moments I stood on the edge of success and still heard their voices in my head, telling me I wasn't enough. And then, the turning point. The day I realized their disbelief wasn't a prophecy. It was a limitation. Theirs, not mine. By sunrise, I had written over 70 pages. It felt like bleeding and healing at the same time. I wasn't sure if I'd ever publish it. That didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd finally stopped carrying their voices like gospel. I was writing my story now. The next morning, I made a call. Not to them, to my legal team. I instructed them to file a cease and desist against my parents for false claims regarding financial support. I also authorized a public statement, not vindictive, just factual, clean, controlled. In recent reports, certain individuals have misrepresented their involvement in my journey. I want to clarify that my success was the result of independent effort, built without the financial or emotional support of my family. I wish them well, but they were not part of this ascent. That was it. No revenge, no bitterness, just truth. And then I moved on. Truly moved on. I launched a new mentorship program for young innovators from dysfunctional families, the ones who had talent but no applause, dreams but no safety net. I gave them what I never had: belief, resources, room to fail without fear. I watched them bloom, and every time one of them succeeded, I felt something in me heal, not because I was becoming the parent mine had failed to be, but because I was breaking the cycle. Months passed. The media forgot the scandal. My parents faded back into obscurity. I received a letter once, handwritten, clumsy, full of half-regrets and unspoken wants. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Some ghosts are meant to stay buried. I wasn't running from mine anymore. I wasn't building to prove them wrong. I was building because I finally knew who I was without them. And that was the real mansion. Built brick by brick from every, "you'll never make it," I turned into fuel. The view from here is different. It's not about looking down, it's about finally looking ahead, and knowing, without doubt, I did this. By myself. There are moments in life where time doesn't stop. It just crystallizes. It becomes denser, sharper, heavier in your hands, as though it's daring you to notice. Not in the dramatic sense people imagine, not with thunderclaps or cinematic slow motion, but in the quiet thud of realization. It was in one of those moments, seated alone in the auditorium of a newly built innovation academy bearing my name, that I knew the story was done. Not just a chapter, the story. The arc that began in a broken childhood home, stitched itself together through nights of hunger and humiliation, and arrived at a place of unshakable peace. The applause had faded. The final speaker had taken the stage. The ribbon had been cut. Cameras clicked. Young minds filled the halls like electricity just finding the circuit. I sat there watching it unfold, not as a CEO, not as a figurehead or philanthropist, but as someone who finally understood the shape of his own life. A boy who had once been mocked for building dreams out of cardboard had now built a sanctuary for others like him. I had done it, and not because I was gifted, but because I endured, because I remembered, because I chose, day after day, not to let their laughter become law. When I returned to the penthouse that night, the place was unusually silent, even for me. There was no meeting waiting, no calendar buzzing. I had cleared everything, intentionally. The entire world had finally been told what I wanted them to know. My team ran the companies like a machine I had engineered. My legacy was already writing itself without my hand. My wealth was no longer something I managed. It existed in the background like gravity, constant and unremarkable. I poured a glass of black coffee, not to celebrate, not to forget, but to mark the moment, and stepped onto the balcony. The city pulsed below, vast and infinite, like a second sky turned upside down. I remembered the first time I had seen this view, the disbelief that this space belonged to me. Now, years later, it felt natural. Not deserved, earned. There was one more thing left to do. I opened the small safe behind a false panel in my bookshelf. Inside, there were no jewels, no cash, no hard drives with secret patents, just one envelope. Thick, heavy, my memoir, unpublished. Unfinished only in the sense that it had not yet reached the final page. That page was now blank, and tonight I would fill it. I sat down at my desk, lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, and opened the final section of the manuscript. My hands didn't tremble. Not anymore. Not like they used to. I wrote, "To the ones who couldn't believe in me, thank you. You taught me that the absence of support doesn't mean the absence of worth. You taught me to plant roots in stone and bloom without sunlight. To every night you dismissed my dreams, I answered with another line of code, another sketch, another sleepless stretch of obsession that became innovation. You didn't raise a millionaire. You forged one, through fire and fear and shame. And that is your legacy, even if you never claim it. I no longer hate you. I no longer need you. I am finished carrying the ghost of who I was in your house. The house I bought was never for you. It was for the children you never understood. For every dreamer you called foolish. For every artist, coder, builder, believer who grew up in a home where vision was a dirty word. They will have light. They will have walls that echo with encouragement. They will have ceilings that do not exist. I built them a future. Not because you failed me, but because I refused to fail myself. And that is how this story ends. Not in bitterness, not in revenge, but in freedom. Signed, the man who never needed your applause to become real." I closed the document, printed it, and placed it with the rest. I knew then that I wouldn't publish it in my lifetime. Some truths are not for the world. They are for the record, for the quiet dignity of finishing what once seemed impossible. As I stood from the desk, something inside me finally loosened. A thread pulled free. The invisible tether that had bound me to their ridicule for so long snapped without a sound. I didn't even notice how tightly I'd been clinging to it until it was gone. It was time. Time to live the rest of my life not as a survivor of their doubt, but simply as myself. Free. Whole. Done. Weeks later, the final headline ran. Nothing scandalous. Just a small note buried in the culture section of a major magazine. Hart's Legacy Academy opens doors to thousands. Built for the believers who had no one to believe in them. No mention of my parents. No fabricated stories of sacrifice. Just the truth, plain and unmarred. That was how I wanted to be remembered. Not as the child of someone, not as the product of pain, but as a singular force. Self-made, self-written, and finally, self-finished.